If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to MINDSHOCK True Crime. You are listening to the Steven Avery series. This is, of course, stemming from the Making a Murderer Netflix documentary, which was so biased in favor of Manitowoc County and the state against Steven Avery. They only revealed 1% or so of the corruption. And that is why the MINDSHOCK podcast regarding the Steven Avery case had to start, because it was just so biased against Steven Avery, just in so many different ways. And this is actually episode 36, Strang and BUTING, investigating how effective Steven Avery's counsel was in the case of the alleged murder of Teresa Hallback. Obviously, there's no incontrovertible proof that she's dead. She might be dead. Is there any evidence pointing to Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey? This is episode 36, and we haven't seen anything definitive yet. So clearly, this is a wrongful conviction, even if they're guilty. I've said that many times. I am, of course, your host, Bruce McGuire. And we will be examining Strang and BUTING extensively in this podcast. There's a lot of conflicting sentiment regarding these two lawyers and whether or not they did a good job or not, whether or not the cards were stacked against them so much that they just couldn't do anything, or were they complicit in the entire frame-up and wrongful conviction, or did they set out to be fair and legitimate, and they became compromised somewhere along the way? I started examining this in the previous podcast, the Timeline Re-Examined. If you haven't checked that out, make sure you check that out. Make sure you check out the entire series, because I will be referencing points that we have gone over prior. If you enjoy the podcast, find it interesting, and want to help support the channel, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, hit that bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. If it's still not working, you could just go to youtube.com/mindshock or youtube.com/mindshock Like and share this podcast. Keep awareness of, not just in this wrongful conviction, but in other wrongful convictions as well. Truth and justice. What is the harm in verifying truth, verifying that justice was served? It's very telling when guilters or people that I guess don't believe that there are any innocent people in prisons, that they just get all triggered whenever someone wants to re-examine a case to see if they really got the guilty parties. And it's really weird. There's a common saying, trust but verify. On MINDSHOCK, I say distrust and verify, because humans are fallible and humans can be corrupt. Not a revolutionary concept, although for coincidence theorists and authority-worshipping cultists that think police never get it wrong and court officials and state officials can never be corrupt, I mean, maybe it's revolutionary for them. So like and share the podcast, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. Okay, so I'm just going to recap where I left off in the previous episode. And these are comments from TikTok, Manitowoc. Good timeline and analysis, but in focusing on Kratz, for sure a truly despicable man, you're letting Strang and BUTING off the hook. They were sent by Wisconsin AG Lautenschlager to ambush the case. Excerpt from Beyond Avery Road, BUTING and the Beast by Chad Spencer Kelly, page 161. Only days before Fallon comes on board, less than half a block from Fallon's office, Dean Strang is meeting with Stephen M. Glynn in Strang's office. Strang is a colleague of Fallon, and their offices are located half a block away in Madison, Wisconsin. Civil suit attorney Stephen M. Glynn has recommended that Steven Avery settle and hire Strang and BUTING immediately. Strang and BUTING were horribly negligent, and Avery even sued them for ineffective counsel in 2012. No DNA expert, coerced minor confession, although BUTING was an expert in that area. Over 120 closed-door, off-the-record meetings between the state and defense took place with the judge in Avery's trial. Bottom line is Avery won his lawsuit had Avery won his lawsuit, Wisconsin was potentially on the hook for $1 billion in false convictions from the Innocence Project. And as I went over in the previous episode, it's not just about Avery's 36 million. And going back to Beyond Avery Road, Beauty and the Beast, page 30, but the truth of the matter is there were 900 Steven Averys writing to have their cases reviewed. But the state made sure none of those potentially innocent were being fast-tracked to freedom because of the possibility of a great financial loss due to multiple civil suits dipping into the state budget. If all 900 inmates writing to the Wisconsin Innocence Project were innocent, became insulted by a $25,000 cap-off, and petitioned on average $1.1 million in compensations, as Steven Avery will, then the state budget would be hit hard in the pocket for claims of up to $1 billion. Simply, new forensic DNA evidence was a threat. Thus, Attorney General Lautenschlager assured that the backlogging of the state crime lab was a must. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, when you're talking about over $1 billion going into the state budget, it's not just about Steven Avery. And again, these authority-worshipping cultists who claim that only guilty people are in prison, it's like they're incapable of comprehending that humans are fallible, even if officers and courts aren't corrupt. Humans are fallible. It's not that revolutionary of a concept. It's possible to get it wrong. And now the question is, what percentage is wrong? So depending on what you look at, anywhere between 1 and 40% of people in prison are innocent of the crimes they were accused of. Now, I don't know the exact breakdown. It might be 10% are completely innocent of any criminal activity. And then a certain percentage are known criminals, but the particular crime that they're accused of, they were innocent. And that's what they're in prison for. So if some of these are violent offenders or even nonviolent drug offenders, they weren't guilty of the charge that they're for which they are serving. And that's a travesty. And I don't know how anybody could be okay with that, because potentially that's just so many more innocent people will continue to be in prison. But look at the desperation and the shutting down of logical inquiry and review. Because if you're truly objective, logical, scientific, and you really want the truth, blind justice, why wouldn't you review cases? And we see this all the time. As DNA technology progresses, you see more and more people that were actually convicted on DNA evidence being released because they're actually innocent. And the so-called hard science wasn't hard. You're talking about a fallible human technology extrapolating pieces of genetic material, and the assumption is that it's a 100% match. Now, 99%, you could say that's good enough, but it's not even really 99%, because you're working with limited information, possibly degraded samples, and the technology is amplifying, extrapolating, approximating in order to make these matches. So yeah, sure, it could be accurate, or it could not be accurate. I mean, this isn't rocket science to understand that technology has limits. And to hallucinate and pretend there are no limits, that's the silly nonsense that got all these innocent people in prison in the first place. That's why I don't think DNA evidence is the only thing that should be relied on. And of course, not all DNA evidence is equal. In certain cases where you have really good samples and you can prove that they weren't planted, they were legitimately collected and all of this, and you have other evidence, I mean, clearly that would point to someone being guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean 100% either. But beyond a reasonable doubt would surely, you'd have to be over 90% sure, over 95% sure. Not 50-50. Not less than 50. I mean, this kind of silly nonsense, again, is why so many innocent people are in prison. I'll review one more post. I'll review a couple more posts here before I get into the defense of BUTING and Strang. Excellent post. The only part I'd strongly disagree with would be the part of BUTING and Strang having the right track but the wrong target. I mean, if that were true, what was their track and who was their target? To me, it's obvious. They had no clear track and certainly no definitive targets. There were so many opportunities for them to impeach witnesses, discredit experts, and clarify perceptions, which they simply let go by the wayside. It's unimaginable. They were soft on everyone they could have easily hammered, like firing an arrow into the bullseye of a target. Instead, what they did was more like lobbing water balloons over the target so no one got wet. I don't know when people are going to be able to put aside the impression of those two men from making a murderer, Hell, I really wanted to like them too, and accept what it really was, and that is, Buting and Strang were complicit with the state and never approached putting on a vigorous defense of Steven Avery's rights. There is not one aspect of their defense where anybody can say they fought and they fought hard. Sad but true. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these two are evil men, but I feel it's more likely they caved into peer pressure and just didn't really challenge the state. A response here, unjust and unfair assessment of Buting and Strang, in my opinion. They did repeatedly challenge the state, which you'd know if you read the transcripts, both trial and pretrial. You're entitled to your opinion of their performance from watching Making a Murder or from reading transcripts, though it boggles the mind how you can say that if you had read them. But you are not entitled to accuse them of being complicit with the state of basically throwing the case, which you have done. That is sad. What is sad but true is that you've maligned these men without cause. Shame on you. And what's curious is this individual might just be psychologically projecting, but there's a lot of dubious links with Buting and Strang and state officials, which we'll be examining. Another response here, I think the biggest problem faced by Buting and Strang was the sheer volume of information and the amount of time they had to examine everything. Would need to hire a whole team to scour discovery and find everything wrong. The biggest mistake the defense did was to play by the rules while the other side cheated. How can anyone win if the other side cheats? Hides discovery, mislabeled discovery, lied to by the state. They were good attorneys with a dumpster fire. They aren't cutthroat, and they needed to be in Ken Kratz's courtroom. Loy, the public defender, dropped the ball. He could have worked on discovery, but it piled up and then was given over to Buting and Strang in one large lot. They had 8 to 9 months to work on this expletive. They also trusted that investigators did their job. Another response, I couldn't agree with that more, relating to the attack on Buting and Strang. They didn't do the job they were hired to do, plain and simple. They never even questioned the so-called partner in crime. Money was the supposed reason for not hiring witnesses, but it doesn't take money to ask questions of the non-experts, like Brendan Dassey or even the state star witness Bobby Dassey. They failed and now roam the world with speaking engagements, making money off this case. It's wrong, in my opinion. Now, let's look at a more ardent defense of Jerome Buting. This was posted on TikTok Manitowoc 4 years ago. Okay, so there were some confusing and inaccurate allegations about Buting's relationship with Peg Lautenschlager during the Armstrong case. Buting and Lautenschlager would take on a case in July with an oral discussion with the former Attorney General, helping Buting to advance reputation regarding a different wrongful conviction case. Not that Buting needs me to defend him, since the facts of the Armstrong case speak for themselves, but here are the facts. 1993, Ralph D. Armstrong, who was imprisoned at Waupun and had served 20 years in prison for the rape and murder of a Madison student, sought help from the National Innocence Project, a New York-based program that seeks to overturn wrongful convictions through the use of DNA testing. 2001, attorney Barry Scheck, co-founder of the Innocent Projects, referred the case to Buting, who filed court papers requesting a new trial for Armstrong. Quote, the state deliberately suppressed and withheld for approximately the last 13 years information that a known third party confessed to the rape and murder of the victim in this case, end quote. Again, this is how Wisconsin operates. We see evidence of this everywhere. July 12, 2005, the Wisconsin Supreme Court overturned Armstrong's conviction after tests excluded him as the source of crime scene DNA. Quite curious. For the defendant, Jerome Buting and Barry C. Scheck, oral argument by Jerome Buting and Barry C. Scheck. For the plaintiff, Sally L. Wellman, Assistant Attorney General, with whom on the briefs was Peggy A. Lautenschlager, Attorney General. An amicus curiae brief was filed by Keith A. Findley on behalf of the Wisconsin Innocence Project. Buting and Lautenschlager were adversaries in this case, not partners. August 2005, new criminal justice commission formed for Wisconsin by the State Bar of Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin Law School, Marquette University Law School, and Wisconsin Attorney General Peg Lautenschlager to improve Wisconsin's criminal justice system by identifying and remedying problems that have led to wrongful convictions. The new commission was comprised of 27 well-respected prosecutors, police, defense attorneys, judges, and victims advocates, as well as community leaders from outside the system. Among others, the list included Keith A. Findley, Stephen M. Glynn, and Jerome BUTING, likely due to his recent success in overturning Armstrong's wrongful conviction. Also in 2005, the Dane County District Attorney's Office prepared to retry the Armstrong case. However, while the new trial was pending, a woman testified at a hearing that she had called the Dane County Assistant DA John Norsetter in 1995 to report that Armstrong's brother Steve confessed that he, not Ralph, was guilty of the crime and that he feared Ralph would be exonerated by DNA and come after him if he found out Steve was the real guilty party. The woman said she described Steve's gruesomely detailed confession to Norsetter, who did not report this evidence to defense attorneys and did not pursue the lead. Steve Armstrong had disappeared shortly after the crime and never again contacted his brother Ralph. Steve died in 2005. Wow. February 2006, based on BUTING's experience with his previous wrongful conviction case, as well as his successful appeal of a 2003 case where the jury selection process was outrageously biased due to widespread publicity, is it any wonder that Strang teamed up with him for the Steven Avery trial? BUTING says he and I had worked on other cases where we'd represented co-defendants, so we were familiar with each other's style. He thought we would complement each other, and I think we did as the case went on. 2006, more forensic testing was done, and the crime scene evidence from the Armstrong case, including mitochondrial DNA tests, an advanced technique that can develop DNA profiles from degraded samples and hair follicles. Mitochondrial DNA tests of hairs from the crime scene included Ralph Armstrong. Because mitochondrial DNA is inherited from one's mother, Ralph and Steve Armstrong would be expected to have the same mitochondrial DNA profile. Further DNA tests of the semen stain from the robe belt excluded Ralph Armstrong again, as well as the victim's boyfriend. Despite those exculpatory results, the state announced it would retry Armstrong for the crimes. Then, despite a court order requiring prosecutors to notify defense attorneys anytime evidence in the case was moved or analyzed, Norsetter secretly ordered additional DNA tests. These illegal tests used up the biological evidence, preventing any further testing. Interesting tactics by Norsetter. Moreover, the Y-STR DNA testing Norsetter ordered in 2006 focuses on the Y chromosome and would not have distinguished genetic material between males with the same father. Wow, Norsetter is a devious one. Is this the guy Ken Kratz was learning from? Full details of the case and the atrocious behavior of the DA Norsetter and the Wisconsin Crime Lab are reported on the innocenceproject.org and also on isthmus.com. September 2008, BUTING requested probe of Wisconsin State Crime Lab, which resulted in the Wisconsin Department of Justice doing absolutely nothing about the drunken, dry-labbing, unethical analysts at the Wisconsin Crime Lab. And these are documents available on the Department of Justice state website in Wisconsin about all of this drunken activity during DNA testing. 2009, Reserve Judge Robert Kinney dismissed the charges against Armstrong, who was then awaiting retrial, after finding the now retired ADA Norsetter should have disclosed to Armstrong's lawyer a purported confession in 1995 by Armstrong's brother, Stephen Armstrong, which was reported to Norsetter by two women. May 2015, after a federal judge twice rejected Armstrong's civil suit against the state because it wasn't specific enough, Armstrong filed an amended lawsuit, this time naming his defendants: retired Dane County Assistant District Attorney John Norsetter, retired Madison Police Detective Marion Morgan, retired Detective Robert Lombardo, and two state crime lab analysts. The Court of Appeals rejected the defendants' qualified immunity claims and held that Armstrong's case could proceed. So yeah, Wisconsin and the state crime lab, there's a history of corruption here and covering up corruption. So again, to all the guilters in the Steven Avery case who hallucinate that the state crime lab is infallible and all these individuals are infallible, quite silly. I mean, there's just so much precedent here. Armstrong claims prosecutor John Norsetter acted in bad faith by allowing the loss or destruction of drug paraphernalia found at the crime scene, evidence that could exculpate Armstrong and implicate the real killer. The evidence was allegedly tossed in a plastic trash bag, placed in an office storage locker, and lost before Armstrong's trial in 1981. Convenient. After the Wisconsin Supreme Court vacated his conviction and ordered a new trial in 2005, two state lab technicians, Karen Daly and Daniel Campbell, deliberately violated a state court order to preserve evidence by destroying an exculpatory DNA sample in 2006. I have no idea about the veracity of the other claims in the original poster's thread against Strang and BUTING in the Avery case. There are no sources to check, but okay. So this is curious. Now, my comment here is Strang and BUTING, how many corrupt law enforcement or state officials start out corrupt? How many of them start out as people with integrity and character and just simply are surrounded by so much corruption and threats they have no choice but to cave, or simply, budget, financial bribes, whatever, depending on their home situations, or even not if they're greedy. Regardless, it's really weird to hallucinate that all corrupt people start off corrupt. It's just really, really bizarre. I mean, I don't know if that's what coincidence theorists just always do in order to pretend there's not the level of corruption that there is. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, it's really weird. If Strang and BUTING were compromised, who said they were compromised from the outset? They might have fully entered the Steven Avery case attempting to represent their client in good faith and find truth and justice. And something happened along the way. Some things were made clear during these 120 behind closed doors meeting with the judge. Something happened. And again, with Peggy Lautenschlager, again, if she was corrupt from the get-go, we also don't know her exact, in pro wrestling, it's called a heel turn. When she turned heel, was she always corrupt? Maybe. I mean, I'm not arguing that there aren't people that are just corrupt, evil individuals and they enter professions already corrupt and evil. That's very possible as well. But it's possible corruption, it can be a slow burn process that happens in any field or profession as well. So if this is all a show, Peggy could have, this whole thing could have been a setup show to make it look like they're trying to get rid of corruption when they're not. And of course, she would want to have this kind of controlled opposition with people that she could control in charge of this anti-corruption panel and all of these things. So what's interesting is that there does seem to possibly be a judge here, Judge Adelman, who allowed the Armstrong civil suit to move forward and said that the district attorney and crime analyst did not have immunity. He was also the judge in Steven Avery's civil suit who said that Tom Kucerik didn't have immunity. So again, the people alleging every single individual is corrupt, it doesn't seem to be. There might be a couple of non-corrupt individuals, but again, with the majority, if the system is just rigged in a particular way where the critical individuals are not letting the truth come to light, it wouldn't really matter if there was one or a few people not in on it. A response here to all of this, what I get out of this is the Wisconsin Crime Lab has no ethics, no standards, or cares about the letter of the law. Dirty, rotten scoundrels puts it mildly. Even the federal judges do not care about truth or justice. It sounded like the lab probably have destroyed Avery's evidence, or whatever they called it will be changed or missing. So another response here, let me guess, made no money, knew the cards were already stacked against Avery, and a great peril befell them as Tom Fallon subjected. Come on. That is an open public threat by third in command of the state attorney general. The point is, Strang and Fallon are on first-name basis, as well are BUTING and Lautenschlager. As well, no peril befell them, and Supreme Court Justice Ann Walsh Bradley's kids are partnered in Dean's firm, Strang and Bradley LLC. For great peril that never came, but Strang partnered with Bradley's shows that Fallon's statement in court was an act. I mean, an ounce of iota not of the peril. Is everyone blind? Buting and Strang knew Fallon was the lead power on the case, not Kratz. Fallon had more pull than Judge Willis. But do Strang and Buting mention this at all now to the public? Open your eyes. The state capitol conducted the conviction, not the judge and DA from small counties. Now, again, referencing the potential $1 billion or more on the hook from wrongful convictions. They had to shut this case down. So again, would they allow attorneys? Now, if this is true, I'm not saying it's true. If this whole conspiracy theory about them taking a hit to the budget, I mean, obviously they would take a hit to the budget, but the conspiracy theory is what would they do to prevent that if that had happened? Would they allow non-controlled attorneys to represent Steven Avery? Another post here by X Avery Files CSK Theory. The point is the citations of Avery in the case of Armstrong, cited by Buting. The point, Buting was recommended by Glynn and Kelly. They were told by Lautenschlager to recommend Buting. The point, Avery never once picked them on his own accord. Conflict of interest is raised. In the merit, Buting and Glynn were helping Attorney General Lautenschlager propose to the Doyle administration to the provisions she wanted. Buting is in continuous contact with both Gahn and Lautenschlager involving the citing of Avery, which the majority of those citings were in the best interest of 3 bills that benefited the state. To be morally fair, he was already working on Assembly and Senate bills alongside the Attorney General for the Doyle administration, and those bills were pending. It is severe conflict to work both sides of the field on Avery's behalf and the state's, which can only conclude Buting had more time invested in political vestiges that were helping to make sure people like Avery wouldn't get awarded millions. He helped to draft the bill that concluded X amount of money in the event the released does not sue. Buting was seated to help save the Department of Justice millions in the long run regarding people wanting cases opened in 74 counties. Further claims here, the family confirmed that they learned Lautenschlager and Buting were friends in 2011, and they were pissed. I'm assuming he's talking about the Avery family here. More points here. Lautenschlager was not his adversary. She happened to be handling the appeal. They had been in cahoots since Buting helped to fund Janet Reno. Regardless, both were involved with Avery. Severe conflicts of interest. You have the two popping up with direct affiliation regarding Avery prior to the case. In defense of Buting, why isn't Buting screaming at his tours to have Fallon investigated? If you think Kratz led that, think again. Lautenschlager had her puppets. Fallon handled the majority of pretrial motions, paved the way for Kratz. Buting was there for it all. Why didn't he tell us that Fallon was the man, not Kratz? Why? Because Fallon is his friend, Lautenschlager's assistant. And on your note of the Armstrong case, Lautenschlager never disputed the first oral comment as opposing. She threw Buting a bone in this case. So you can come to the Buting all you want, but the truth, he and Lautenschlager are great friends behind the curtain, as are Dean and Fallon, who are on a first-name basis. Strang and Buting are contributing to Wisconsin Innocence Project and Greasebox salary. Don't get it twisted because you are closed-minded. 98% of attorneys nationwide are playing for the state. Latin for lawyer. Don't be a sheeple. I have 2,000 plus screenshots from attorney magazines in Wisconsin. Best thing about attorneys is they leave a trail. So you might want to see how evidence of their peril, as Thomas J. Fallon subjected and promised, because I see not the first iota. In fact, Strang has a Supreme Court Justice Abney Wallace Bradley in his pocket, who her kids are partnered with Strang. Who is Fallon's great friend and Lautenschlager's? Buting wasn't just an ordinary lawyer. Buting was board of directors of criminal law section who meets periodically with state capitol. Buting was helping to draft the provisions of the Avery bill, plus two separate bills, a Senate and an Assembly regarding wrongful convictions, but not on the prisoner's behalf. But the state attorney general's behalf to save money for the Department of Justice in the event of another release. Buting never wrote up the state crime lab on 2008 on behalf of Avery. Furthermore, Buting knew about the contamination in 2005 but didn't report it because of Lattenschlager, his alliance, was still superior. But only when Van Hollen became the Attorney General and finally adopted the caseloads in 2008 from his 2007 entry to being seated as Attorney General did Buting file complaints. Mind you, Van Hollen just bashed Lautenschlager in a public spill only days before Buting filed. You don't want to go toe-to-toe with me, politics, Mr. Closed-Minded. I will spin circles around you like a ballerina. Glad you bought the biggest sellout defense shenanigans in America. The shoddiest defense ever, performing not for the jury. Read the transcripts, lay it all on the table. Nothing could have hurt Avery at that point, good or bad. But the strong points your beloved Buting kept from the jury. And that is truth. Where is the peril? It never befell them at all. Lautenschlager appeared right beside Strang on an April 12, 2016 panel. It looks like great peril befell them, ? Come on, get it together. They are using media to brainwash you as the state to consider Avery guilty before he was guilty. Believe nothing of what you see in the media, especially when lawyers that lost a case spewing forward to sell out when Avery is no longer their client. And to this smug Buting you defend. Media on their behalf has served its purpose. Pull the wool back, man. Okay, interesting. So, if this is all true, again, I'm not saying it is or it isn't. This is MINDSHOCK, where the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. But there are certainly dubious connections with both Strang and Buting. Now, not to throw these guys under the bus, but perhaps, since they're knowing the level of corruption they're dealing with, did they think the state was going to kill Steven Avery? And they basically threw the case in order to spare Avery's life in the hope that this would all be uncovered later on and he would be set free, as opposed to he'd be killed if they tried to defend him properly. Here's an article from the Daily Star. Making a murderer lawyer feared Steven Avery would be killed in framed suicide. The lawyer who represented Steven Avery feared he was going to be killed in framed suicide moments after he was convicted for the murder of Teresa Halbach by David Rivers, March 18, 2019. Jerry Buting told Daily Star Online he suspected Avery could have been killed by police because it was, quote, easiest way to get rid of him, end quote. Avery had earlier been wrongfully convicted of rape and attempted murder in 1985 before he was released in 2003 after DNA proved his innocence. The Making a Murderer star then pursued a lawsuit that could have earned him millions, but was then convicted of the Halbach murder in 2007. How coincidental. Mr. Buting and co-counsel Dean Strang argued to jurors that Manitowoc County Police framed Avery, as detailed by the Netflix hit. And believing police feared another fight back, Mr. Buting moved to make any potential death look suspicious. Mr. Buting told Daily Star Online, quote, as soon as the verdict came in, they whisked him away out through the little side door that leads to the jail. We had to wait along with his family while the sheriffs escorted the Halbach family out. In the short length of time that it took us to get down to the jail to go and talk to our client, they had already whisked him away in a waiting police car to Manitowoc now that he was convicted. I was frankly paranoid he was going to suddenly end up having killed himself, in their theory, that they could have done something and made it look like a suicide. Easiest way to get rid of him, they knew he didn't give up the last time. So I made a public statement at those press conferences we had every single day. I let the media know what happened, and I said they're responsible for him and that he was not in a despondent mood. He was disappointed, of course, but he was certainly not going to kill himself. So if anything happened to him in jail, it kind of put them on notice that it would look very suspicious if something happened to him now. Mr. Buting added, it was very peculiar that they were ready to whisk him away so quickly. He continued, there was no urgency, no rush, no need to take him that day. He had been sitting in jail in a neighboring county for months. I really began to think there was something really nefarious going on here, and that the only way I could try and short circuit that was to make a public statement that he was not suicidal and that he would appeal and fight this. And now that they chose to take him so quickly into their custody, the public is watching them, and they should be aware that if anything happens to him, they are going to be held responsible. Manitowoc County Police deny framing Avery for the murder. As if they would admit to it, even if it were true. Retired detective Andrew Colburn sued Netflix and the makers of Making a Murderer for defamation in a case filed last year. He alleged the series insinuated that he planted evidence to frame Avery. Avery, who denies the murder, became arguably the world's most famous prisoner thanks to Making a Murderer. Mr. Buting and Mr. Strang became stars of season 1 as the case riled up many viewers around the globe who felt Avery was innocent. Avery's nephew, Brendan Dassey, was also convicted for the Hallback murder. Since then, Avery has been represented by lawyer Kathleen Zellner, whose efforts to appeal the decision were detailed in Making a Murderer Season 2. He has since been granted a right to appeal, which will be held in a circuit court where it will be decided if he should be granted retrial, according to Zellner. And as the world awaits the outcome, Mr. Buting has relived the moments after his conviction for the Hallback murder. Mr. Buting, who wrote Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer and America's Broken System, told us, well, I was hugely disappointed. I thought particularly as they had been out so long, 4 days, that it would have been a hung jury, if not an acquittal. It was long enough even back then. I knew there were cases where you would think there's no way a jury is going to find somebody guilty, and that they came back guilty, and the opposite. It's like cases, there will be 5 minutes guilty, and they come back not guilty. So juries are unpredictable that way, but it was sort of surreal. You stand there, and it's the worst part of any case when you're waiting for the jury verdict to come back. It's nerve-wracking. You've done everything you can, so now you're just waiting. Daily Star Online has approached Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office for comment. All right. So what can we take away from this? Are Strang and Buting both compromised? One of them's compromised. And did Buting not trust the deal he made because he knows the corrupt people that he's dealing with? So even if they made the deal that Strang and Buting could only touch on certain aspects of the case that were approved, and they weren't allowed to really defend properly, and they could only point to corruptions in certain ways, in certain fashion, to give the appearance of a legitimate trial. I mean, obviously it doesn't look that legitimate, but it could have been, I guess, if they weren't even allowed, I mean, they could have possibly handcuffed Strang and Buting even further by not even allowing what they did allow. But again, if they're putting up a sham, a charade, they need guys to go along with it. So was part of the deal that they wouldn't kill Avery and make it look like a suicide? And was Buting not convinced that they would hold up their end of the bargain, that he went out of the way to make these comments just to make sure they held up their end of the bargain? And are Strang and Buting really the good guys, and they knew they couldn't win this one, so they just did what they could to keep him alive in the hopes that he would get a legitimate trial later on, for example, with someone like Kathleen Zellner coming in? I mean, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered here. And there's been some Twitter discussion in the past of Manitowoc County specifically suiciding people that wanted to talk. I mean, there was the case of one individual who accused law enforcement of killing Ricky Hostetler and the cover-up of his death, which we haven't gone into that in depth. Perhaps I'll do a dedicated episode. Apparently, law enforcement is responsible for his death and the cover-up, in addition to all these other deaths and cover-ups throughout the decades. And this particular individual is supposedly commit suicide, but it's I don't know if that was ever even investigated. This guy mentioned fearing reprisal. So that begs the question too, how many times have they suicided people? And the one thing that I've mentioned throughout this podcast series is Steven Avery definitely knows something about how law enforcement operates. Is the reason why he doesn't really spill the beans, and he's made a few little references in phone calls and things like that, but he never explicitly states what the real truth is. Is he fearing for possibly his parents' safety or his own, which is why there are certain things that he won't say, and he wants to only focus on his own innocence in terms of Teresa Hallback? I mean, there's a lot of questions here. How much do BUTING and Strang really know? How much do they really know? And how much did they know was futile or would result in the death of not only their client, but possibly other individuals? If they really are good guys, what choice do they have depending on the severity of the consequences for blowing the whistle on some of these nefarious individuals? And those are the questions that really need to be asked, because on the surface, it seems crazy that BUTING and Strang to claim that they did a great job. I mean, this is clearly ineffective counsel because there's no real evidence against Avery. But they played the game. Is it possible because there were threats made? Is it possible that they were bribed or coerced, whatever, but they knew they had no choice anyway, so they might as well have taken these bribes? Again, it's very difficult to put yourself in these positions. Anybody can easily say they would have done this or that or been noble and honorable. But life is kind of complicated, and if there are death threats being thrown around with evidence that they would be executed, these threats would be executed, I mean, what choice would these individuals have, particularly if they understand how far the corruption ladder all of this goes? So plenty more to ponder, plenty more to discuss. We'll be looking at Redaunt in the next episode, and there's just so much more to go over. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the MINDSHOCK podcast in the Steven Avery series. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell for notifications. Like and share this podcast and keep awareness up in this wrongful conviction as well as others. Share the podcast, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority case topic, logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. Could also be a guest on the podcast, depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind. Leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire, signing off. Catch you guys next time.